Okay. Righty then. Testing one, two, three. There we go. Hey, Joe. Well, I guess it's time. Hello, everyone. So Wednesday office hours, the 6th of May, and we'll probably go the whole 90 minutes today, although I'm not promising anything. It might be less than that. As you can see, Medium says this could take 2 hours. Um, I won't take 2 hours. There's two articles. The second article, we're not going to go all the way through, but it's an instructive article in the sense that it provides the sort of economic anthropological side to thinking about semiotics. And it includes a reference to field work but the front end of that particular article is uh, covers a the kind of the theoretical overlap with the front end article, the Dantas article. So uh, I might as well not stall and get right to it. So I was thinking, because their lives kind of overlapped, I try to imagine, not unlike other imaginings, the true or imagined story of Wittgenstein attacking what's his name with a poker, a fireplace poker. So, um, but that's not the story we're going to tell. The story I would tell would be a 57-year-old Karl Marx having lunch with Charles Sanders Peirce and Ferdinand de Saussure. De Saussure would be in 1875, 18 years old, almost a college student. Peirce would be 36, and Marx would be just before he gets ill. Um, and lest you think that's unimportant, the critique of the Gotha program took a lot out of him, I would suppose. But then, it's also the deal that the carbuncles got him. So, he had a kind of miserable 6, 7 years after that. And um, anyway, so I try to imagine that there might be some way in which these would all come together. And they do come together in terms of that they do represent some issues in um, post-war uh, anti-imperialist Marxism, as we were talking about the other day, and so I start with a particular set of ideas. Uh, it's a paraphrase, and it's an important paraphrase. It's a paraphrase from Capital Volume 1, and I think it's Chapter 1 and Chapter 7. If use value is the product of the labor process, exchange value must be regarded as the product of the valorization process. So we start with use value, we go to exchange value. There is the whole point of this is that valorization is occurring. It's that value is being produced in an abstract sort of way, even though there is underlying this a material process of labor. But as I've tried to explain before, it's not labor itself, but rather labor's potentiality. And the reality is, of course, you always have potentiality built in with the reality. So, that without getting too heavily into that, and thus the commodity, which is a way of talking about this, because commodities are, abstractions of a kind, yet they are also the unity of exchange value and use value. So they're the intersection of a lot of different things, not unlike having lunch with Marx, de Saussure, and Peirce. So the unity of exchange value and use value must be regarded as the product of both processes, that is the labor process and the valorization process. So you have two things, a value creating process and a work process of one kind or another, which are merely two forms of the same process. So this is a paraphrase that's fairly accurate. I mean, in the sense of that it combines three different translations and other kinds of things, but it essentially tells the story. And this is the story we'll look at today, is how can we talk about that thing which is more abstract, and yet is fully engaged with, what goes on in the world. That is, stuff, action occurs, energy gets expended, exchange is made, and that they are a same process. And that's the idea of talking about semiotics, is because we exist with respect, particularly humans, but that there's an entire range under which you could talk about semiotics. But for the moment, we will talk about humans. Um, And so that semiotics is a way of talking about all of this, although since in a historical way, semiotics is built on a set of structural histories. De Saussure, Peirce, they're all looking at certain kind of systematic human sciences. So that's what they're really concerned about. And they're looking at it from slightly different perspectives. Um, they take particularly different angles on essentially the same process, and often name the same thing with different names. And so there's an entire constellation of uh sort of references. And so it sounds too much like jargon. And when you think about Peirce as a kind of obsessive, and I mentioned the last time about whatever it is, 423 different signs, it's much simpler than that. And you don't have to learn all the jargon. I mean, what we're looking at here when we start talking about economics, that's to sort of funnel down or narrow this down, is a smaller subset of signs that engage with exchange value and use value and valorization. So one way of looking at this, Marx distinguishes concrete labor, the labor process producing use values, from abstract socially necessary labor, which determines value exchange value. That's, value big V, exchange value. And then shows that under capital, the labor process is also a valorization process producing surplus value. That's all pretty simple. I mean, you have to go over it many times probably, but use value is, when you do stuff, things that have a use without getting into using the word utilitarian or utility, but there are use values. And then there's things that, markets, barter, exchange value. And that under capital, the labor process is also a valorization process. So surpluses are created, and this is kind of how we get to exploitation. It's how capitalism is successful in building wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And, the problem, of course, in the modern period is the problems of intergenerational wealth. And you can see in the current situation that uh, certain people who are simply, terrible people that don't really care about other people. They're just pathologically not geared for it. Uh, want to acquire as much wealth as possible, and they don't really care about other people. In fact, because they're people like narcissists, etc., they're very solipsistic. They don't really think about other people. And I don't have, this is not an abstraction. I mean, you can just see this in practice. Um, someone who would talk to a room full of children about other children being massacred. I mean, it just boggles the mind. But anyway, that happened yesterday or day before yesterday. So anyway, back to the text. That conceptual linkage appears most clearly in Capital Chapter 1, where commodities are introduced, use value versus value, big V value. Right. And Chapter 7, the labor process and the process of producing surplus value. So you can see that these are, fragments of a single or a, integrated thing. And the commodity, not to rehearse all this history, but recall that Marx, in order to get to the publication of Volume 1, is that he front loads it with certain concepts, and particularly in the translation that becomes Book 1, it gets front loaded with the commodity as on the one hand, an abstraction, but it is a better way of not going down that deep rabbit hole about labor. It doesn't exclude labor, rather, it is looking at another point in the process. So, and commodities are a kind of abstraction. You create all kinds of other things, including meanings. And that's why, you have markets for commodities, and that's a highly abstracted and is built more on speculation and futures and a bunch of other stuff. But it's not as palpable as one may think. On the other hand, there's oil being moved around in tankers. But on the other hand, we just don't have pork bellies anymore, or for some X number of reasons. And as a commodity, in a kind of technical sense, commodity, of course, is a much larger way in which we think about a variety of things. So you can talk about sex work, for example, as a commodifiable thing, but that's a whole nother lecture. But it is dealing in abstractions and of course, much more extreme abstractions, but I'll stop right there. So I've included David Harvey's diagram, and you can review that at your leisure. Note, of course, that commodities is right there in the center. And you can see that it relates to other things: luxuries, wage goods, means of production, the production of value and surplus value, labor power, all of those things we just talked about. It's in there in diagrammatic form. And that's perhaps the beauty of the diagram, because it is in and of itself semiotic. That is, it has a variety of signs, a bunch of that include signifiers and signifieds and all that other technical stuff. But you can see that it all still comes back to certain central ideas. On the one hand, you have nature that gives or provides free gifts. And then you have people who do certain other kinds of things, and they're not identical, but yet they do relate. And they do relate to things like reproduction or reproducing labor power. They they also provide, the means of production, raw materials, etc. And ultimately, after this sort of central idea about commodities, we get realization, which is David Harvey talks about this, but a variety of other folks talk about this idea of realization of value in money form. That is the idea that you can talk about commodities, but the only thing, the real part of it, the palpable part of it, is realization. That is when it becomes valorized, when it becomes value. And you can see that in the David Harvey thing, where you got the little box that talks about the distribution of value. And you can see you have essentially volume 3, that is wages, rents, profits, interest, taxes, and ultimately reinvestment. And then all kinds of other matters, supply and demand, money capital. You can see that commodities has two places in here. You have labor as a commodity, that is your labor power. You sell it. You sell its capability uh, to the capitalist, and you get combined with other things, raw materials, etc. And you're part of this bigger process that is on the production side, and then you make stuff, and then that gets into a distributional system, and it becomes or is a commodity. Now, it's pretty clear that there are other sub commodities in this process, and so there's lots of other ways in which you can divide up the thing, this set of ideas. And that's kind of where semiotics comes in, is to be able to organize this. Now, the point is that it's not an absolute organization. It's really flexible. And it's always contingent. It's always based in a whole system of interpretations, of interactions that require exchange. That's the kind of way it sits in the world. And the whole problem, of course, and when you get to more abstract versions, like in financialization and a bunch of other things, it gets much more complicated and makes one's head hurt. On the other hand, it's also capital and it's also power in that sense. So, it's a little more complicated. Needless to say, it is the transformation of nature. And because humans are doing it, it is culture. Now, when animals do it, it's not culture, it's just nature. But, and yes, there's plenty of exceptions or weirdness, but for the moment, without talking about mammalian stuff, uh, this is the idea of the Anthropocene. That is, that humans have had an effect on this larger geologic history of, a material history. And without getting into the long story, it is this idea that time has been altered in certain ways. And the point that some people make, not everyone, and it is for some people, it's a problematic construction, is that is the Capitalocene is a way of talking about those abstractions that we've just been fiddling around with, to be able to further talk about not just a human effect, but a knowledge effect or something, that, and yes, when you talk about knowledge, it implies the cognitive, that it's abstract, it's epiphenomenal, it's not material, it's whatever, ethereal, but it's not. It is integrated in our actions and whatever. You wouldn't be able to have motives or needs or desires or whatever without some degree of general intellect. And so that, and Marx thinks about this. But De Saussure and Peirce also think about this too. Now, on the one hand, Marx would probably not be very happy with Peirce and De Saussure in the sense that if he was looking at both these systems, it would look too mechanical, and it is very mechanical. It's very systemic. It's very functional, and those are the critiques. They're the same critiques, in fact, that are made a century later against analytic Marxism. That it's all too pat, closed system, formalistic, functionalistic, blah 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 blah. That's all okay. I mean, not that it's okay, but you need to be able to methodologically approach the problem, understanding that all of these things sort of exist there. You don't spend your time trying to trash one thing and promote something else. It's not that kind of conflict. It is the fact that it is an open system and that it does have multiple possibilities, and that you just have to be smart enough to be able to attend to all these things going on. So, and we're getting closer to where we actually are supposed to start today. The reason being that Marx generally assumes steady state dynamics or equilibrium conditions. It is worthwhile, however, and this is a Kokelman, which is the second article, is talking more in an anthropological way, but he is attending to the underlying Marxist concept as well as the semiotic issue. So you can see how he does this, and he does this in I think in this is from a note. The reason being that Marx generally assumes steady state dynamics or equilibrium conditions. That's kind of the general thing we think about in Marx, and we've talked about this before, the difference between structural dynamics and, that's part of all the classical political economy, et cetera, et cetera. So Marx generally assumes steady state dynamics or equilibrium conditions. It's worthwhile, however, to assume that steady state, when he may not actually be using this properly, but steady state and equilibrium are the exception rather than the rule, and hence supply and demand questions, as well as desire and need questions, are as important in the determination of value as labor power and means of production. So you can see that there's a not a simple dichotomy, but a complex set of connections among all of these things. And this one paragraph traces all of the issues in post-war Marxism, in fact, that you have questions of supply and demand and all those other things, but you have to begin to think about it as a cognitive issue, that supply and demand is also about desire and need. And there's an entire set of arguments that are built on that is built on top of that have to do with at a slightly different or more extreme end, psychiatry or psychological stuff. And that's kind of what was going on with the Frankfurt School, is to try and attend to those things. Now, in the case of the Frankfurt School, and if you sort of look at what they were doing, like with Pollock's work, who's is a not so much lesser, but he's just a more stable element of the Frankfurt School, that they don't really, mess with economics itself. They sort of assume that economics is, because of Marxism and blah, 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 that it's all pretty stable. And that what Frankfurt School is looking at is all of these other things that are much more complicated because, of all the philosophical things that go on in the mid 20th century, including war, existentialism, the atom bomb, blah, blah, blah. All that sort of stuff changes the way in which we think about stuff, that it's not so stable, or it's decentered as in the technical sense. So that's from Kokelman's paper. Now, Kokelman is putting this in a note, so it's not, he doesn't front end this into his argument. His front end argument is a semiotic argument, is one that says, okay, we can look at this complex of signs and we can actually interpret uh, uh, the presence of ecotourists in a primitive setting and analyze it as a system of signs. That is, there's all these kind of sets of correlations and other interpretations, signs that are at work and that are much more complicated. And that's the whole, that I've compressed, obviously, I've oversimplified nearly a century of anthropological thought. But the had Margaret Mead uh, read a little bit further and was more, less involved with field work and, sort of thinking semiotically, she would probably have realized that her subjects were screwing with her. That's the later revisionist thing about Margaret Mead. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But that's kind of the complexity of cultural systems. At the front end of that, of course, is that there's an entire body of structural anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, et cetera, where and it has all of its own issues. It's a symptom of imperialism and colonialism, and it is the study of quote unquote primitive cultures relative to a sort of dominant hegemonic imperial culture. So that fracture or set of fictions is at work. And what Kokelman is trying to do, and I think he does a good job of it, is just that he's a little overinvested in, and you can see from a career point of view he would have to be, and yes, he picked something that was really stable, and you can be a real careerist building on this one thing. But you got to move further than that, and that's a whole nother story, and I'm sure that he will in his career, because he certainly pointed in that direction, and this one little article does address the front end of that question, social ontology, commodity, etc. So that's not to trash Kokelman. Kokelman, is just moving along. Yale, Columbia, blah, blah, blah. All that careerist crap is at work. Now, these are two figures from a different article, a third article, as it were, as a Korean wrote this stuff. And he's taking essentially the same triangulated elements, where we take sign, object, interpret. Remember, we talked about these triads or three triplets, or ways in which you can think of subject, object, and the thing that goes in between. And so that's kind of at work. Note, of course, that you still have what Marx is talking about, the commodity, right? You can see some familiar terms there, right? Consumption, product, and you can see some newer things that include production, commodity consumption. So in this right-hand diagram, the commodity exchange, you actually see the mechanism between Department 1 and Department 2. That's what it is. It's not that controversial. And, you can get a big fight with people about it. But the point is you'd be, barking up the wrong tree. That this is not horribly controversial. You can see on the lower left that the combination of material and material labor, that's the means of production, it's all pretty normal. And then you see product, and then you see communication labor, which is kind of the big deal about semiotics, is to say, well, how is it that labor is organized, or how is it that you can have a workplace, what happens there, and this underlies the whole argument about the PMC, et cetera. And the critique of the PMC is that people begin to separate this into sort of class interests or whatever, and that kind of clouds up the history of it. And then you have other variations, particularly when you get to Italy, because then there's this whole other set of things going on. that are conflicts within, the left and among other things. And so you can see all of these things are vital little ideas, and they're still there. They are still there. This doesn't really go away. These questions are still, Fuchs's work is kind of, floats in on this, but then he has a whole other set of things he wants to do with it that are interesting but somewhat tedious and don't really quite get to material. Well, anyway. So, from commodity production to sign production, a triple triangle model for Marx's semiotics, and Peirce's economics. So, you see, there's a kind of inversion there. Marx, you'd never call him a semiotician, but he does talk about signs. And Peirce does talk about economics. He's very interested in it, but he doesn't fully integrate it as from a material point of view. And you could say, and some would argue, that Peirce is not so much a materialist as he is an idealist, that he's a positivist even, that he's just concerned about how you put all these things together. But that's a feature of that's, Peirce is just different. He's got other things on his mind, lighthouses, telegraphs. He's got all kinds of other things going on in his interest. But you can obviously see, Marx is interested in telegraphs and other things too. So there is a weird overlap that has been pretty much fully excavated in the latter half of the 20th century. But, as the last week's sort of article suggested, is that it's sort of underattended or underdeveloped. And, you got a little sense of my little regret about, that certain things hadn't really changed from the 70s and 80s and the 1970s and 1980s. And it that doesn't mean that it's fallen into disrepair, is anachronistic or whatever. It's this idea that certain things are, you know, classic or ubiquitous or eternal, or there's this whole other set of arguments. And if you're really looking at it, it goes back to what Marx was doing in his dissertation. Talking about Epicureans and other stuff. So anyway, we digress again. This is from an article by Juho Kim, and you can see that we moved from something that was a little bit more about Marx to a little bit more about what Peirce is. So you can see percept, sign, meaning, interpreting. A sign requires interpreting. You're interpreting meaning. There's a percept, which talks about the front end of the sign, and it obviously things happen kind of immediately, but that's the kind of point of doing semiotics. You begin to identify certain moments in the process, and that's why Kokelman does that, because as an anthropologist, he wants to see when you have the interaction of indigenous people and tourists, you see a whole set of things going on that are very material, but also quite abstract and problematic for all kinds of other, in other ways. But it's very useful to think that way, because you begin to see that you could do one thing, like the Sherpas going up K2. On the other hand, you can see that they created an entire informal economy and kind of a criminal system to exploit climbers who go up K2. And they've only just revealed that it was a kind of cartel kind of thing because they had a monopoly on the guiding process. But anyway, that's another story. The point is that you have a complex system. So the point that we're trying to get to is the study field of critical political economy will also be that of expressions and social representations through the value concept. So ultimately, all of this, arm waving and stuff is about mediation. to now you could say that well, it's just medium, media, the plural, and mediation, the third thing. But it's more than that. And mediation of cultural relations of the use value that expressed through the exchange value. So already you have a certain directionality built into the argument, but that's no different than Marx talking about Department 1 and Department 2, because there is a bias for productionist stuff. All right. Now I include Harry Cleaver's chart, which, surprise, surprise, has certain resemblances to not only David Harvey's chart, but also that little, it's a relatively primitive Peirce and Marx sort of chart. And this is the much more complicated one for chapter one, volume one of Capital. And so this is the entire Harry Cleaver, who spent years doing this, has figured out kind of all of these little sub attributes, which include socially necessary labor time as opposed to actual labor time. So see on the left, you can see use value, and then you can see the thing that we've talked about before, big V value, and subsequently the exchange value. And this argument never gets fully worked out. I like thinking that it's all value, and that there's just use value and exchange value. And so, but that requires a whole bunch of arguments too. The point being is that on the one hand, you have, or each element, each side of this use value, exchange value, has quantitative and qualitative elements. It has measure on the quantitative side, and it has something that we know about attributes in the use value sense, that features, etc. An actual or material value, it's still qualitative, but there's substance there. So you can see the difference between useful labor and abstract labor, and socially necessary labor time and actual labor time. And so you have this combination of things, and I won't rehearse this here, but it is the difference between this thing on the right here is that the thing that Heinrich is dealing with constantly, and that is the so-called value form. That's this little circle on the right. There's a lot of ink spilled on this, and it is opposed to or privileged in some discourse over the bodily form, which is on the left-hand side, which means you just sort of, the world is out there, and you want to do useful things and be pragmatic. Now, the point, of course, is that as you move through this, you get different forms of exchange value. That is, simple forms that have relative and equivalent elements, an expanded form that deal with further developments of that. And yes, there are bad versions of it. And then you get to a general form, which is what Marx is doing in that first chapter, is trying to figure out, well, there's stuff that's kind of on the left-hand side, sort of more relative, and then, or more particular, and then there's other stuff on the other side that's more universal, more generalizable. And so, a lot of stuff, as I said, front-ended into volume one. Now, you get this little thing that you have bad infinity and good infinity, and we won't go there, but there's a lot of stuff going on. And so we get to the structure of the argument goes to the money form, which is another universalizable element of the commodity. That is, you get money, it facilitates, it allows us to be more mobile about the concept of the commodity, because money is much more abstract, but money itself has those things that are described in the things we looked at with the two articles today. The difference between metallic money and paper money, it does have exactly that concrete and abstract difference. Now, I won't go into the long argument of why gold bugs, people who think that we should go back to a metallic system, are just idiots because we've already stepped forward into an entire abstract financial system, and to go back to metal is just somehow weirdly nostalgic, but reactionary and really problematic for all kinds of reasons. But anyway, and it is ultimately a form of fetishism. So commodity fetishism becomes this thing, and then obviously people get too tied up with it. And that's where the anthropologists sort of come in, because they spend all of this time, literally a century, talking about the fetish thing, how it's organized, how you have cultural subgroups, and you can do all kinds of stuff with it, and it's interesting and problematic, and it builds an entire set of arguments. But ultimately, you can't stay in the jungle. You got to get out more, and that's kind of so it gets to, and I'm probably not going to get to what I wanted to get to, but there's this one little article that's done by the what's it called, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance Group, and it's a guy, Rosenzweig, writes this article on the Rockhill debate. And you see me sort of whining about Gabriel Rockhill the last couple of times, and the point is that there's something there that's problematic. And this little set of paragraphs here actually straightens it. Well, to me, it straightens it all out. And this is old wine in new bottles. This is the same argument about sort of philosophical purity versus something that's a little bit more open and less closed. So what the debate leaves out: the Rockhill debate at its best raises important questions about the relationship between intellectual production and power. These questions deserve serious engagement, but engaging them seriously requires resisting two temptations that the Rockhill debate, as it has unfolded, has largely succumbed to. So there's a problem of overdetermination. The first is the temptation of exposure as explanation. That is, the substitution of scandal for structural analysis, the confusion of documentation with causation, the comfort of the unmasking that appears to settle what it has only begun to investigate. And this is a critique, with all due respect, to that whole CIA and the Frankfurt School thing. And it is more scandalous, and he's got the receipts, but it's part of a much larger set of questions, and I don't think he fully attends to that in his working that out, because he wants to talk about somebody pays the piper, etc. This temptation, when yielded to, produces not historical materialism, but a moralized narrative of purity and contamination that mirrors in its formal structure the very conspiracy thinking it claims to oppose. So this is a kind of, without getting into the psychoanalytics of it, this is a critique of that it, it is about moral kind of things as opposed to actually doing analysis. And so that's problematic to some folks. Now, the perspective here is, of course, to try and put it, in perspective. And it's not trashing Rockhill for, being, whatever, philosophically incorrect or whatever. It's much different than that. He's just trying to lay out some of the underlying issues, and that is to say, well, Western Marxism is not anti-imperialist enough, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's a kind of weird straw argument that, doesn't need to be pursued. Now, the second is the temptation of doctrinal authority. That is, the appeal to a tradition whose theoretical positions are treated as settled, as an absolute, rather than as themselves requiring historical and materialist scrutiny. So, dialectical historical materialism, DHM, as Rockhill deploys it, is not a method for investigating history. Rather, It is a framework for sorting history into pre-established categories. So it's a structural argument or functional argument, and it suffers from the same argument as I've tried to explain before, is why certain members of the left didn't like analytic Marxism because it has too many pre-established categories. Well, you sort of have to, it's breaking eggs and et cetera. You do really need some sort of structure in order to get at, agency questions, for example. So its authority derives not from its demonstrated explanatory power, but from its in identification with a tradition that many on the left continue to regard with uncritical loyalty. Now, you can say this is the same problem of Trumpism, for example. There's uncritical loyalty, and it's a cult. Um, but those people aren't very smart, whereas these are smart people making the same mistake, as it were. That loyalty, when it overrides the demand for critical inquiry, reproduces exactly the intellectual pathologies, the substitution of orthodoxy for investigation that historical materialism was developed to overcome. The whole issue of 20th century historical materialism is exactly, is trying to get out of these kind of, you could say, issues of uncritical loyalty, of faith on the left, which you may not think that that's horribly important, but it truly, entire revolutions were kind of fought along these lines. People got purged for these reasons, and this is really unfortunate and stupid, but it's history. The genuine inheritance of historical materialism is not a set of correct answers, but a set of demanding methodological commitments. That is, to ground explanation in, as we've been looking at, structural conditions, to attend to contradiction and conjuncture, which we'll talk more about that, but there's a way in which you can think about this as a function of structural condition that allows you to get, because you're making a methodological commitment, is to be able to move from things that are just descriptive or interpretive to something that might be more explanatory, to move towards it, the empirical, as it were, but not the empirical, absolutely, although, Koppelman could be seen as trying to do that too. But anyway, to apply critical scrutiny consistently and without special pleading, and to maintain the distinction between and explanation, which is clearly a historical question, between correlation and causation, that's where we begin to look at the qualitative and quantitative issues, and between institutional history and intellectual determination. And these are the kind of pivots on which thought becomes developed in the latter half of the 20th century. And so I know that seems a little too abstract, but really, most of the fundamental arguments, that is, the critique of the Frankfurt School, from a left point of view, as opposed to this weird right-wing critique of, misreading of it all and, demonizing it by the right. There are arguments there. It's just that it's not quite what, the right wing thinks it is. It just isn't quite as deterministic, and in fact, it isn't even as cultish as the right wing does its stuff. So anyway, this is a sub-article in the larger collection that I was reading from last week. It's an article by Marcos Dantas. It's a semiotic inquiry, or recherche semiotique, the semiotics of the commodity in the Marxian concept of value. You can see why I chose this one out of the 8 or 10 articles, because it does intersect these issues. And it's not the answer. It raises, useful questions, and does a review or overview of these kinds of issues. it doesn't make any new theoretical kinds of things. It just lays it out, and I think this is a useful article to do that. Uh, so this is 2020. Um, it has a citation. Here's the abstract. The Marxian concept of value is acultural and hence a semiotic concept. Semiotics, as I've said before many times, is the idea of a human science. And that's not, sort of overblowing the process. It's just that social science is nothing if but a human science. But, the way in which that term gets used is, highly problematized. So, semiotic concept rather than economic, based on a scrutiny of Marx's writing, this article proposes that Marx's analysis of, yes, the commodity can and should also be interpreted as a semiotic treatise. So it's not just a family resemblance that we saw those idiot diagrams that I showed you before, but the fact is there's something similar, family resemblance, that is useful and important, and that the commodity can also be a sign system. And it does. And you can, drill down and do all kinds of analysis. To what end is a whole nother set of questions. But I like thinking that it's a useful tool to get us to other kinds of questions, not to do it for its own sake, which is what some academics do, is well, they build bigger, typologies and taxonomies, and it that's okay, but it's more than encyclopedic or whatever. This insight may be also relevant to contemporary Marxian investigation concerning labor and value. Remember, we just talked about that, right? Valorization, right? Um, in capitalism, insofar as the notion of value of commodities is concerned, whereas the literature on the crisis of value theory is focused primarily on the relationship between use value and exchange value, and of course, abstract labor, the present paper focuses on the aspect of the sign value of commodities in Marxist theory, on how and how the notion of value represents human labor. So that's the abstract. Now he gets down to the brass tacks, as it were. When preparing in the Grundrisse, and we're back to the Grundrisse again. This is that thing, it's why David Harvey returns to it. It's that moment that sort of unexamined or unattended to in the history of Marxist thought, that there's this thing that didn't get published, and it only pops up kind of later on, and we discover Marx has got a lot of other structural ideas going on, and it's inconvenient for some people who believe in a dialectical materialist analysis and class struggle and blah 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 blah. It doesn't negate any of that. It just gives you this kind of other window on it. His initial conceptual ideas on commodities value. Marx understood that value, big V value, must also have an existence that is qualitatively different from commodity. And in the actual moment of actual exchange, this separability must be an actual separation, because the natural diversity of the commodities has to contradict their economic equivalent. So what you see here is something dialectic. That is, often you have this kind of, contradicted moment, but it is also dialectic. So you have to sort of learn to, sort of appreciate it in that sense. So, and both can only coexist if the commodities acquire a double existence, not only a natural, but also a purely economic existence in which the commodity is a quote unquote mere sign. A letter for a relation of production, a mere sign of its own value. So to translate all this, it is just simply talking about the abstraction of the process. And you could go back and say, labor power is never identical to labor, but there is something that connects the two that can never be eradicated. There's something there. And this kind of thinking, talking about it in this way, allows us to look at in more granular detail on the question, which sounds more academic on the one hand. On the other hand, it gives us an appreciation of the kind of micro macro, the particular and the universal sort of operating in very simple actions or acts. So for Marx, commodities have a double existence. They have a natural existence, that is, according to their physical shapes and contents or biological, chemical, physical properties through which they meet human requirements. They also have an economic existence as a sign of value. Now, value has other possibilities for meaning, right? Or as meaning. They could be very simple message-oriented things that you just need to know something in order to not get hurt or whatever. But there's other things as a sign of value where you can build wealth or accommodate greed or whatever. Commodities are produced to be exchanged, but since actual human needs can very greatly diverge from each other, something is required to make the exchange of commodities, which enables some measure of comparison between them. This something is a value. Now, further on down in the article, we talk about, how is it that things are commensurate? Now, the idea of something commensurate is not something that corresponds, but actually can be measured. And underlying the philosophy of science is incommensurability is ultimately the test for the viability of a theoretical research program. You really, it in the big picture, you got to, it's got to be provable in that sense. But anyway, we'll get back to that. The commodity as a value is a sign, Zeichen, whose substrate, and this word substrate comes up rather often. Now, substrates can be a lot of things. A piece of paper is a substrate because if you put it in the Xerox machine or the photocopying machine, it's a substrate on which it's electrically charged and adheres, fuses powder on it, and dissimilarly, the inkjet doesn't quite work the same way, but similarly, the commodity as a value is a sign whose substrate are the material products taken to and exchanged in the market. So substrate is something, it's a layer, as it were, of things. If those products undergo metamorphosis during their many stages of production, they were still in the department one, the value stays the same and can be identified as any commodity, whatever their practicality or their practically infinite forms may be. So what we're looking here is a certain kind of stability, a concreteness. Values have both of those things in it. It has the sort of palpable, concrete. You can see it, you can touch it, you can taste it, you can feel it. But that's not the whole thing, obviously. It it has other things that are going on, message, comfort, other things that are a little more abstract. So if each commodity must meet particular needs, value is, when paraphrasing the known definition of sign by Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, that which represents any commodity. Value is, when paraphrasing the known definition of a sign by Peirce, that which represents any commodity to anyone. So the commodity is a sign. It's not the thing itself. It's part of the thing itself, but you have to sort of work through that. And ultimately that's kind of the second half of the 20th century, is to confront the fact that some things, this representation of commodities is problematic for all kinds of reasons. That's the Frankfurt School looks at it for that very same reason, because it inverts the relationship between culture, and reality or whatever. And So there's a whole set of other things. I mean, it's why, the Frankfurt School looks at these more psychiatric things, looks at music, looks at a whole bunch of things. So some paragraphs later, Marx wrote, commodities must be exchanged for a third thing. Just talking about third things is exactly what we're looking at before: subject, object, and something betweenness of between. In a dyad, in a relationship, you have subject, object, and the object has a subject, etc. Third thing that can only be a social symbol, gesellschaftliche symbol that should express a social relation. So we're right back to what Marx is concerned with, is social relations that is different than the production elements, the raw materials, et cetera, but rather the labor process is a set, or of social relations. It doesn't get its meaning otherwise. It requires, it's based on social relations. So he adds this symbol, this material sign of exchange value is a product of exchange itself. That's the point of this thirdness, this betweenness, is that it is the exchange that is important. So you can call it exchange, but you can also call it, and this is where it gets complicated, that it is mediation. It is this idea of something else is going on, but it's kind of hard to see on the one hand. On the other hand, you can see it all the time. And this is where, in current sort of social digital processes, SDP, which you'll see further down, it's why talking about it, for example, attention studies of Amazon, et cetera, it doesn't seem quite real, but in fact, it kind of is there, and it's there because people are building wealth on it, Amazon, etc., and not the execution of an idea conceived a priori. So it's not predetermined, but it is kind of, as it happens. So here, symbol appears as one material form of sign. So recall that sign is only one element, and that you have other things that are part. In the Persian concept, you have icon, index, and symbol are all signs. All three are signs, and yet they're kind of elements, fragments of the same thing. So this specific symbolic form of the sign is the money. So, according to Marx, insofar as capitalism has evolved since its primitive forms until its current modern status, commodities gradually developed until reaching this condition of being expressed in money. That is, the money commodity form. I mean, and Cleaver talks about this as being commodity form before it becomes money. That's a whole other set of arguments, but it's sort of the money functions in a more abstract way on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a store of value, it's more universalizable, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, to speak more in reality, that's still a problem because of, for example, currency exchange. Anyway, that is, be substituted by its own symbol, this symbol that becomes the conscious sign of exchange value. The conscious sign of exchange value. So, it could be as simple as opening up your wallet, but that is a sort of conscious sign of exchange value. That's not really, but it's a kind of mundane example. The value, therefore, acquires in the symbolic form of money a separate existence from the actual commodity. And now this is that dualism that Marx is talking about, and now exists alongside it also as a commodity. So this is when Cleaver is talking about the commodity form of money, or money commodity. There's an actual commodity, however that's constructed, but there's also money. And so this is the thing. Marx adds, the material in which this symbol is expressed, in which this symbol is expressed, is by no means a matter of indifference. See, that's the point of utility theory, is that you don't make a decision, you just sort of, you're on the curve, you sort of, you have equal, you have free choice, or it you have free will operating, choices not infinite, but multiple or plural, is expressed by in which a symbol is expressed is by no means a matter of indifference, however different it seems historically. Society's development elaborates not only the symbol, but also the material increasingly suitable for it, a material from which society later tries to disentangle itself. The symbol, if it were not arbitrary, requires certain conditions of the material in which it is represented. So, to get down to brass tacks again, get to the material world, there are signs for words. For example, the alphabet have an analogous history. So the point of understanding symbols is that on the one hand, they are signs, but they are also complex symbols. So Chinese characters in their original form had pictorial representational issues. It looks like a bird or it looks like a something or other, a dragon or blah, 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 blah. But as but that doesn't tell you the whole story. It's that it's not picture equals 1,000 words. That's bunk. The 1,000 word thing is not really what we're talking about. It is because it's made in reference to the Asian languages. But the thing is that symbols are much more complicated. And what Peirce and others are trying to do is to try and say, well, there are different ways in which you can talk about it. There's different, and you don't want to call them functions, but you want to call them different aspects of how stuff works. Some things work because they resemble other things. We invest meaning in, iconography. Iconography and iconology exist because people are, during the time where it's more powerful, is when people are illiterate, or there's only an elite that is literate. And so you can see already there's a disparity there. And then indexicality is something else, as I've yammered on about before. And then symbols are even more complex because they require an entire contextual thing. A commodity, therefore, to get back to commodity, as conceptualized by Marx, is not just any object perceived in the world of facts and things, but a specific form, the commodity form. That's why Marx front loads the chapter 1 with this idea. He begins with an abstract idea that is the commodity, but he uses it in order to get back to material things. I mean, that's, the linen and coats and all that other stuff. It's easier to explain it by saying this is a commodity. This is how a commodity operates, because you can generalize from a lot of different things, and the commodity still remains in a kind of weird way, and you want to sort of be able to talk about it, and that's what Marx is trying to do, and that's why book 1 has that kind of purpose. A historical presence in that sense. Now, of course, it's not the Communist Manifesto. It's not, all of the other philosophical material, economic manuscripts and blah, 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 blah. But it is a kind of crystallizing in published form of the core argument of what capital is. And not that it's correct, not that it's absolute, not that it's, applies, equally everywhere, but it is a way in which we can talk about commodities. So, of course, there should be something sensitive, matter with volume and mass, to which this form can be referred. And so, clothing, furniture, food, beverages, vehicles, jewelry, costume jewelry, tools, machinery, minerals, or whatever. And you can see why Marx does what he does, right? That, linen, coat, and then coats and gold. All these, it's relatively simple, but, you want to be able to, I think it's intelligible in that way. So talking about a commodity is also talking about a sign. The many and diverse forms of the commodities could be expressed by a quote unquote, a letter, Buchstabe, a sign. Similarly, it does not matter, for example, how many sensitive forms of there might be, it may be in the world of objects. how many sensitive objects of form there are in the world of objects. They can all be expressed in a single word, chair, as in the chair form. Just as a chair occupies a precise position in the system of the relations of a specific language, in this case, English, and for this reason can have its meaning correctly learned in any communication between among those who master the code of the language, the commodity, also in its relation with other commodities, will speak its own language. Commodities only betrays its thought in that language with which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities. Now, it already gets crazy because, you can already object to the discussion of this because, chairs, for example, you do not need a chair to perform the action of sitting. The chair, in fact, has no real relation to sitting in that sense. It does have a possibility. It does provide you with one means of sitting, but the action of sitting is not necessarily contingent on chairs. So, I know that's kind of mundane, but that there is a sort of issue at work there. Aside from the fact that you can call a chair something else in another language, et cetera, et cetera. This language is a system of values. When we say chair, we need a matter, energy, audio, substrate, in addition to our own body. And I sort of suggested that is the fact that you can perform the act of sitting without necessarily having a chair. Value is also communicated through the matter energy substrates of the commodity bodies. So, IKEA is there for a reason. It's successful for a reason. And it is a system of signs about quality, about a specific place in which it's made, even though, of course, it's a Swedish company that subcontracts to Malaysia. But anyway, that's another story. Comments on this passage that it's grounded in metaphors of a semiotic relationship. For Terry Eagleton, Eagleton being one of those people that Rockhill's sort of not happy with, many of the key economic categories in Marx are implicitly aesthetic, even having embarked on the detailed study of German aesthetician Friedrich Fischer when he was writing his magnum opus on economics. Firstly, it would be as an aesthetic object that Marx understood commodity, albeit an aesthetically perverted object, as Eagleton commented, and its value would be the meaningful expression of a type of social relationship proper of capitalist civilization, imposing on other meaningful expressions in other spaces and times of human history. So, this, faith is a kind of commodity that it has a real meaning for Christians, for example, and it is literally a commodity. It's a Sunday commodity. So salvation, loyalty, obedience, glory, destiny, sacrifice, etc. So there's a charged meaning that is commodifiable. Before becoming a product of economic relations, value is a product of cultural relations. That's the point, is that you can't do one without the other. And while there is a certain direction or directionality, much of it is driven at the front end, not by economic things necessarily, although, you eat because you're hungry and etc. But there are cultural functions that are part of the entire business. In other words, we can understand value in an initial approach as a communication instrument between people who supports or channels our commodities. A communication instrument, it has supports, that is some means by which it communicates, and some of those means by which it communicates are called channels. There's a whole information theory, Shannon, blah blah blah. Channels are one way of talking about this. The ways in which we you select, you divide up certain flows of communication, whatever. The point ultimately, though, still is that they are all commodities. The following text will include some extracts from Marx in the light of semiotics. In conclusion, we will indicate the importance of our semiotic reinterpretation of Marx as a perhaps theoretically productive route to understanding the quote unquote adventures of the commodity in this quote unquote society of the spectacle. Now, this is all stuff that is problematic to a lot of folks. Commodities don't have adventures. Spectacles, are just glasses. Spectacles aren't, big public events or, concerts are spectacles, whatever. It's all kinds of stuff that is signified in just that, dominated by aestheticizing commodities, which is, where Jameson goes at the front end of his sort of theoretical path. He starts talking about it in these terms. Hence the fetishism of fetishism. You see, remember we talked at the front end about anthropology being sort of overly concerned about commodity fetishism. Now, what is it when we get to a kind of meta condition where fetishism is fetishized? And that I know that sounds a little too ethereal or whatever, but the fact is, fetishism does get fetishized. So the Met Gala, for example, is fetishism of fetishism. In other words, there's clothing, the market for clothing, and then there's something called fashion, which has can be defined in a variety of ways. They're editorial and marketable and blah 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 blah. But those are fetishized forms, and you can actually see that in its operation. In other words, we don't walk around with other people, trying to make sure our skirts are in the right position for photography, which is the whole Met Gala is essentially a photo shoot. A still photo shoot, which is even more stupid, but that's a whole nother story. But first of all, we need to keep in mind that obviously Marx, in his time, did not have access to this sophisticated semiotic tool set developed by Charles Sanders Peirce, Fernand de Saussure, Louis Helmsleb, Charles Morris, etc., and others. And it is a sophisticated tool set. But as I tried to suggest with my little lunch, hypothetical lunch, it would have been sort of interesting to have these people talk to each other. I think Helmsleb and Morris talked to each other. But anyway, on the other hand, he certainly knew about the pioneer semiotic work of John Locke, as is apparent by the references in the Grundrisse. And of course, considering his original philosophical education, should be relatively familiar with cognitive or linguistic theories going as far back as Plato and Aristotle, because that's what Marx did, and more recently to Kant or Hegel. And we've already talked at great length about why one is better than the other, one is more interesting than the other, or whatever. However, if his theory, that is Marx's theory, had semiotic foundations, they were certainly supported by the dialectical logic that led his investigation. That's the whole point of his dissertation. Is to go all the way back to the pre-Socratics to sort of say, there's something that moves all this, and it is something dialectical, and you don't have to make it up. You sort of can see it there, and that's the kind of beauty of it in that sense. Concepts or methods that may not be in line with his epistemological and methodological principles should not be, therefore, directly applicable to Marx. This is ultimately the real problem, is people trying to force analysis into one direction or another. That's the knock against analytic Marxism is a whole bunch of things. It's too Kantian, it's too whatever, it's positivist, whatever. On the other hand, we do not have a semiotic theory that can be considered dialectically canonical, and that's the other side of it. People tried to do it. Baudrillard tries to do it. A bunch of folks try to do this, but they don't quite get there. And they don't quite get there for a whole variety of reasons. And more's the shame, because ultimately all you have are these kind of little, mundane, tricky examples, and not a real integrated theory. Mainly because you can, that's the infinite nature of science, is that it's kind of hard to pin down this stuff. So all you're sort of left with, as we started at the beginning, is certain methodological commitments, and you need to get a sense of that. So, in fact, as we well know, oh God, I'm getting to the end. As we all know, semiotics and semiology unfolds in many branches from its founding masters, but none that has founded a real Marxian semiotic. So, some of these branches or authors, however, may have a positive dialogue with dialectical materialism, mainly Charles Sanders Peirce, Charles Morris, or the more recent example of a real semiotician, Umberto Eco. But that's a whole, that's kind of doing a whole course, because Eco has a certain thing that he wants to do. Although you can see it manifest in really interesting ways, aside from his novels. The 14 points of fascism, that you can identify fascism by 14 sort of signs, and that's a good list to. I mean, it's really useful, and not enough people use it. But anyway, and it's there. Others, such as, and this is the person, I spent maybe too much time sort of thinking about, Ferruccio Rocinante, also Voloshinov, Adam Schaffer, Anthony Wilton, valuable contributions to the construction of a dialectical semiotics. Now, of course, Dantas says, well, this article does not claim to offer any new theory. However, insofar as it will seek to point out the semiotics hidden in Marx's text, it will need to make use of the knowledge already accumulated. That's kind of what we always do academically, including, if possible, establish terms or expressions relating it to a dialectical approach. Now, this seems all very mechanical and very functional, and you have to be sort of aware of that as it sort of proceeds. But you also have to see that there's, not to get too far afield, but there are family resemblances among these things. And it's not, sort of mystical or anything. It just, there are intersection points of all of this stuff. And it is, as it were, a human science at work. And that is why people looked at structural anthropology, on economic anthropology. Marx looks at economic anthropology, etc. So it's why there's an interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, or whatever at work. So, work. Based on the principle that work is a central category in Marx, we will grow closer to this possible approach by first investigating the work as a semiotic activity. To do so, we will support or possibly suggest adaptations of the already established literature by starting with an already referenced Marxian extract. So, there's a lot more going on here, and I don't want to get too far afield, but let me begin with this, and then I'll just do an overview. Semiotic work signs, either in sensitive forms of acoustic images, utterances, or visual, tactile, aromatic, or olfactory, are produced through human activity of communication, right? A fart is it's a sign of Rossi Landi was to identify this activity as linguistic work. The word as a unity of signified and signifier is a product of linguistic work, and its use is an ulterior linguistic work. The point of all this is, of course, following de Saussure, is that there is a science there. It is organized in a variety of ways that are quite functionally viable. They aren't as precise as we'd like to think it, but you begin to only see the precision when you make comparisons among languages, which is the whole sort of point of doing linguistics. But anyway, so Umberto Eco will summarize the relationship between signification and work in his theory of sign production. To produce signs implies Labor. See, we're right back to Marx. Whether these signs are words or commodities, semiotics of the speech must be able to identify according to possible codes. This is the first time we've seen codes. We looked at codes last week. Codes or organization is how we organize some of this, but these codes are not absolute. They're quite malleable. The labor that presides over the codes, however, signifies the labor that presides over the sign's production. So ultimately, we have this is Department One. You know, you're produced. You blurt out noise from your face. You're producing signs of one kind or another, or you're farting. That's also a sign, I suppose, aside from being flatulence. So anyway, there's a whole, we're back to those weird triangles again. And sort of the point of all these is to emphasize the kind of in-betweenness or the third character between things. So here's something that is more specific. And what's interesting, of course, is to apply this, to a specific thing, like the shop floor in a factory. Look at the shop floor in any factory. Let the workers be the letters of B and C. That is this bottom connection here in figure 1. Even if they are seeing each other and some moving in relation to others' movements and possibly needing to exchange some idea about the task underway, this interaction, B to C, is mediated by some code A that configures and defines the task in process and progress in the factory's own jargon. And this will go on further, and you can read it for yourself. But this is that idea of, there's something third about all of this, that you have, two people, but there's something that connects them. And in the workplace, that's actually kind of important. I mean, relative to safety and a bunch of other things. And whether you're, learning how to do a process or this is all Department 1 stuff. And yet, this is not the only stuff. That is, remember, you still have Department 2, and Department 2 has a whole bunch of these things as well. And so you have to sort of reconcile the departments, the Marxian departments in this particular context. Now, to go further afield here, because I now have run out of time. So there's stuff, there's diagrams, there's stuff that talks about the difference between syntactics and semantics, and so there's I'll just throw a few of these things out. Now, this is what Dantes is doing here is to show that Marx is a kind of semiotician, that production then is also immediately consumption. Consumption is also immediately production. Now, I know that sounds like kind of a truism of some kind, or a tautology, but that's the point that Marx is making, is that there's always, remember, I've talked before about circuits of capital, of circulation, that there's interlocking kind of circular things going on. And that's the whole business of Department 1, Department 2, that while it's also immediately consumption, there's also something else going on. And then there's a sub-argument of that on the production side, other sub-forms of consumption are going on. You have to go out and buy raw materials. You have to go out and subcontract for machines. There's all that stuff that is part of that argument. So anyway, there's, it goes on, and there's other stuff. You can see how further developed this idea of objects and their relationship to culture. And you can see Department 1, Department 2, right? Production, FE to FC, FE and FC, and then the interpreted, form of expression and the form of content. Now, Helmslav and a bunch of other people don't do it quite in this way. That rather than expression, there's something communicated, and so there's a whole bunch of other ways you can talk about this. So it's not absolute, but we've already seen that Marx considers a commodity as a sign of its value. Producers and consumers do not exchange products, but rather values that express social relations communicated through commodities. So already this is why we're looking at this weird kind of extrapolation, why Marx goes at the front end by saying starts with an abstraction. The commodity structures all this. It is a kind of important universalizing of the idea that Marx goes to. Instead of building a model of capital, he talks about the commodity as the way of understanding capital, because it combines producers and consumers. It accommodates a whole system, and it's totally intelligible in the mid 19th century to understanding what a commodity is, because they exist. They're there. There's an entire culture in the mid 19th century of commodity forms that are, interesting, problematic, exploitative, all that stuff is there. And that's, kind of Marx's whole point. I mean, relative to trade unionism and politics and et cetera. And you can see how he gets frustrated. So to end today, Marx at the Gotha program, etc. It's pretty frustrating. There's some people who are just reformists. There's no revolutionary potential, and whereas there's these other people who really believe that change can happen in our own time, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's always that tension between the two. And Marx kind of is not so much with the sort of accommodation stuff. He really believes that there's, a model of conflict and culture and contradiction, and it works itself out, and things happen, etc. Whereas other people said, we shouldn't have any conflict, and we should just, get along. And that's oversimplifying the whole Gotha program thing, but that's kind of what's going on. Now, there's a thing on Baudrillard, a better thing on Eco. We may talk about this next week. The point is that this is just and it's not a decorative or laid on or plugged in to Marx. This is trying to show that there is an integrated element of talking about problems in value, problems in labor, problems in meaning that are all part of this. So, all right. Anyway, I should just stop. It's an interesting article. It provides, I think, a good overview of all this stuff, and I only really scratched the surface at the front end. And of course, there's the issue of the commodity sign, which is really important for the latter quarter of the last century in terms of talking about stuff, and people take advantage of that kind of play of signs in terms of analyzing advertising and uh, 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 feminist analysis of consumer culture, et cetera. All that is kind of there, and it opens up a whole bunch of other kind of analysis that it's really important and interesting. But as I began this whole business of talking about Rockhill, is that it's short shrift, and other things are not important in that context. Anyway, so there's that, and I'll close with the second article, Paul Kuckelman's A Semiotic Ontology of the Commodity, is to pursue this in a slightly further way, and it explains in a perhaps more technical way, because he does really go through the jargon of Peirce's semiotics. And while that's okay, and it's a good thing, and you should know how to, well, one should kind of appreciate that it doesn't quite get us to where we want to go. But anyway, that's another story. I'll stop. I've talked too much. I've yammered on. I hope there's some questions. We'll look at the chat to see if there are. Uh, Come on. All right. I'm going to shut the live stream off and then shut the share off. Live stream is off.